I want to start with a photograph, not a painting, not a rendering, a photograph. Taken sometime in the 1870s in what archivists in Lyon, France catalogued simply as Urban Park Conversion Municipal Record Series 4. The image shows a dense layered canopy of trees, fruit trees I would later confirm, arranged in an unmistakable pattern. Tiered, intentional. Mulberry at the outer edge, then what appears to be pear, then quince, then something lower and climbing, trellised against a wall that by the next photograph in the same series, dated just 11 years later, is gone. Not repurposed, not relocated. Gone. And in its place, ornamental grass, a fountain, gravel pathways, the kind of manicured emptiness that cities across the Western world were at that exact same moment installing at extraordinary expense, converting what had been, by all photographic evidence, productive, abundant living systems into what we are now told were modern public gardens. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I looked at another one, from Cincinnati, then one from Melbourne, then Lahore, then Cape Town, and that's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The deeper I went into municipal archive photography from the 1860s through the 1910s, roughly a 50-year window that urban historians treat as the great era of park beautification, the more I encountered the same image over and over again, across cities with no recorded connection to one another. Dense, layered, obviously cultivated food-producing tree systems documented in the photographic record, and then absent from all subsequent documentation. No policy papers ordering their removal, no budget line items, no newspaper debates, no public opposition, no transition period that anyone anywhere appears to have written down. Just present, then gone. That's the thing about anomalies. You can explain one, you can explain two, you can explain a cluster if you squint hard enough and accept a certain number of coincidences. But at some point, the coincidences stop being coincidences. At some point, the pattern itself becomes the evidence. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Before I tell you what I found, I need to tell you what we're actually talking about. Because when most people hear the phrase food forest, they imagine something small, something quaint, a community garden project, a hobby, something marginal. That is not what the historical record suggests existed. A mature, multi-story food forest is one of the most productive systems per acre ever documented. It requires, once established, almost no external input, no irrigation beyond rainfall, no fertilization beyond its own leaf litter, no pest management because the diversity of species creates its own equilibrium. A single acre of mature food forest in a temperate climate has been estimated in the few academic studies that have bothered to look to produce more caloric output than a comparable acre of monoculture wheat. More, not less. More. And indefinitely, without depletion. This raises a simple but critical question. If such systems existed in cities, if they were already there, already producing, already feeding people, why would any municipal government in any era, under any economic pressure, choose to remove them? The official explanation, offered broadly in urban history literature, is that the industrial city required parks for recreation and public health. That the congested urban populations of the 19th century needed open space, green lungs, aesthetic relief from industrial grime. That explanation almost holds until you look at the timing. Here is what official history tells us happened. Between roughly 1850 and 1910, major cities across Europe, North America, Australia, and parts of Asia and Africa undertook simultaneous independent movements to redesign their urban green spaces. The Haussmann renovation of Paris, the creation of Central Park in New York, the Melbourne Parks Plan, the Olmsted system across dozens of American cities, the Ebenezer Howard Garden City movement in Britain, all framed as independent developments, all framed as responses to local conditions, local political pressures, local public health crises. And here's the strangest part. They all happened at once. Not within a century, not within a generation. Within, in many cases, the same decade, the same years. The landscaping philosophies, the specific plant removal decisions, the architectural language of the replacement parks, the gravel paths, the ornamental trees chosen for aesthetic rather than productive value. The central fountains, the iron railings, appear across cities on opposite sides of the planet, with what the evidence can only be described as unsettling uniformity. How does that happen? Not through telegraph correspondence. Those exchanges, where they exist, are about other matters. Not through international conferences. The documentation of those conferences doesn't reflect a coordinated food system conversion. Not through any mechanism that historians have bothered to name. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In 1858, Frederick Law Olmsted begins the redesign of what would become Central Park in New York. In the preparatory surveys, which I found referenced, though frustratingly not reproduced, in full, in a 1923 retrospective in the American Society of Landscape Architects journal, there are notations about existing cultivated tree plantings of a productive nature on the site. What happened to them? The retrospective doesn't say. Olmsted's own published writings from the period don't address it. There is a gap where an explanation should be. In 1853, Haussmann begins the transformation of Paris. The Bois de Boulogne, the Bois de Vincennes, the interior square parks, all redesigned. Contemporary accounts mention the clearing of what Haussmann's own papers call irregular plantations. Irregular. What a word to choose. Irregular according to whose standard? By what measure were they irregular, if not by a new standard that was itself being imposed? In Melbourne, the 1854 survey notes for what would become the Royal Botanic Gardens reference existing food tree systems of apparent age and extent. The 1865 completion report contains no further reference to them. Apparent age, apparent extent, not new plantings, not recent gardens, systems of apparent age, which means they were old when the surveyors arrived, which means someone planted them, which means there was a prior civilization of gardeners, a prior system of knowledge, a prior intention, and that intention was not recorded, not studied, not preserved. It was cleared. The official explanation collapses here. I want to take you around the world, briefly, because I think the geography matters. In West Africa, specifically in what colonial records from the 1880s onward describe as the hinterlands of present-day Ghana and Nigeria, British and French surveyors documented what they called parkland agroforestry systems, landscapes that looked, to Western eyes, like natural savanna, but that contained, on closer examination, an extraordinarily high density of economically productive tree species: shea, locust bean, tamarind, baobab, distributed in patterns that botanical analyses in the late 20th century confirmed were not random, were not natural dispersal, were planted, deliberately, by someone. Long before the colonial encounter, the academic literature on this is real. It exists. You can find it. What the academic literature doesn't ask, at least not loudly, is where the people who planted them went, and what happened to the knowledge systems that sustained them, and why, in the colonial development programs of the late 19th century, those systems were so systematically converted to monoculture export crops, cash crops, crops that fed not the people who grew them but world-spanning commodity markets. Not a coincidence, not a policy decision made in isolation, a pattern. In China, the deliberate cultivation of multi-story forest garden systems, what the Chinese agrarian tradition calls mixed forest agriculture, has been documented back, conservatively, 2,000 years, in certain regions, in certain periods. And then, in the urban record specifically, in the records of city planning from the major dynastic transitions of the mid-19th century, there are discontinuities, administrative changes, new classifications of land use that convert what had been described as municipal food production areas into ornamental or purely administrative spaces. Same window, same disappearance, different continent. In South Asia, specifically in the urban planning records of the major Mughal-era cities as they transitioned through the colonial period, botanical surveys from the 1870s through 1890s note the presence of established fruit and nut tree systems within urban boundaries. Mango, jackfruit, tamarind, jamun. Systems that appear in the survey language as features that predate the surveys themselves by an indeterminate period. Old, already there, already producing. By the 1920s, in the same cities, those surveys have been replaced by planning documents that describe ornamental park development programs. The productive systems are not mentioned, not removed, or rather removed without comment, removed as though they never required a decision. The silence was deafening. This raises a simple but critical question. When something is removed and the removal goes undocumented, is that negligence? Is it efficiency? Or is it intention? I've been talking about trees, about food systems, about municipal records. But here's what I'm actually talking about. I'm talking about knowledge, because a food forest doesn't just produce food. It encodes in its structure, in its species selection, in its spatial organization, an enormous body of knowledge. Which plants fix nitrogen, which plants deter which pests, which root systems coexist and which compete, which canopy heights allow which understory species to thrive, the seasonal rhythms, the water management, the propagation methods, the harvest cycles. All of that knowledge is embedded in the system itself, and it is transmitted not in books, not in academic papers, in the living practice of tending the system. When you remove the system, you remove the practice. When you remove the practice, you remove the knowledge. Not gradually, not through forgetting. Immediately, within a generation. Because the children who did not tend the forest do not know how to plant one. And the children of those children have no concept that it was ever possible. And by the third generation, the idea that cities might have once fed themselves from within their own boundaries begins to sound not like history, but like mythology. The deeper I went, the more I kept returning to this question. Is that what we are? The third generation? The ones for whom the possibility sounds like mythology? Because I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that some specific group with a specific name and a specific agenda decided to erase this knowledge. I am asking something more uncomfortable than that. I am asking whether the erasure required intention at all. Whether a system, economic, political, administrative, can eliminate something without any individual within that system ever choosing to eliminate it. Whether the logic of a certain kind of order is itself sufficient to destroy a certain kind of knowledge. That's the question I cannot stop asking. Let me put the problem plainly. If the removal of urban food forest systems had been a policy, an actual documented policy, we would expect to find the policy. We would expect to find the debates that preceded it, the objections that were raised, the economic analyses that justified it, the transition plans, the records of what was removed and what replaced it and why. We find almost none of that. What we find instead is a worldwide result that implies a worldwide decision, with no worldwide decision-making body, no worldwide communication infrastructure adequate to the task, and no worldwide documentation of the process. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and here is where the conventional historian, if one were sitting across from me right now, would say, this is not mysterious, this is simply how historical transitions work. Ideas spread, fashion spread, the influence of European urban planning philosophy spread through colonial networks and professional journals and international exhibitions, and the movement of trained engineers and landscape architects between cities. You don't need a conspiracy to explain a trend, and I would say, yes, that's true. But then I would ask, why is there no debris? When any major historical shift actually happens, through those mechanisms, through professional networks, through publications, through exhibitions, it leaves debris. It leaves the professional journals carrying the debates, the letters between landscape architects negotiating philosophies, the dissenting voices, the cities that adopted the trend later or partially, or with local modifications, the documentation of what was lost and what was gained, written by the people who remembered what came before. There is remarkably little of that debris. Not a total absence, not a perfect vacuum, but far less than the scale of the transformation should have produced. That's the anomaly, not the change itself, the silence around the change, the lack of argument, the lack of mourning, the lack of any recorded voice saying, we are removing food-producing systems from this city, and here is why we believe that is correct, and here is what we are choosing to lose. This raises a simple but critical question. Do things that are genuinely lost get mourned, or only things whose absence is noticed? There is a category of historical document that urban historians rarely spend time with, because it seems purely technical. Survey maps, municipal cadastral maps, the working documents of city administration, recording property boundaries and land classifications before the era of comprehensive urban planning. I spent a long time with these maps. What I found was that in city after city, in the pre-1850 cadastral records of Paris, of Vienna, of Istanbul, of Boston, of Alexandria, there are land classifications that appear in the pre-industrial records and disappear from the post-industrial ones. Not the parcels themselves, the classifications. Categories of land use that the later administrative vocabulary simply does not retain. In Ottoman administrative records of Istanbul, there is a classification that translates approximately as productive communal tree land within city boundary. It appears consistently in records through the early 19th century. By the 1870s, under the Tanzimat reform period, the administrative vocabulary has been modernized and that classification is gone. The land it described is still there. But the conceptual category, the idea that such land deserves its own administrative recognition, its own legal status, has been erased from the vocabulary. You cannot protect what you cannot name. The evidence suggests something much larger than a landscaping trend. It suggests a shift in the conceptual framework through which cities understood themselves. A shift from a city as a place that produces to a city as a place that consumes. And that shift, wherever I look, appears to have happened fast, suspiciously fast, without the long transitional debates that genuine conceptual revolutions normally require. Not over a century, not across generations, but within a few decades, almost simultaneously, in cities that had no formal mechanism for coordinating their conceptual revolutions. The deeper I went, the more I found myself thinking about a particular kind of knowledge, not the knowledge of how to grow a fruit tree, not the knowledge of which species fix nitrogen. That knowledge is recoverable. People are recovering it right now in permaculture communities and agroforestry programs and community garden projects on every continent. What may not be recoverable is the knowledge of scale. Because what the photographic record from the 1860s and 1870s appears to show, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say appears to show, is not individual food trees, not kitchen gardens, not small productive patches at the margins of otherwise ornamental spaces. What it appears to show is systems, integrated multi-story, city-scale systems that may have been in their productive capacity, something that we do not have an adequate contemporary frame of reference to imagine. What would it mean to know at the level of municipal administration how to manage a system like that? How to plan it across decades? How to integrate it with water systems and waste systems and building patterns? How to sustain the knowledge of its management across generations of custodians? That is not simple knowledge. That is sophisticated knowledge, the kind of knowledge that implies long continuity, institutional continuity, a society that maintained across time a coherent understanding of what a city was for. And here's the strangest part. We have no record of that society losing its knowledge. We have no record of a collapse, a crisis, a moment of rupture where the knowledge of food forest management was lost or superseded or voluntarily abandoned. What we have is simply the evidence of the knowledge, and then, shortly after, the absence of the knowledge, and in between, almost nothing. A gap, not a documented transition, not a recorded decision, a gap, and on the other side of the gap, us. I want to be honest about what I know and what I don't. I know that photographic and cartographic evidence from multiple cities on multiple continents documents the presence of large-scale, apparently mature food-producing tree systems in urban environments prior to the 1850s through 1910s period. I know that those systems are absent from the urban record following that period. I know that the documentation of their removal is, relative to the scale of the transformation, remarkably thin. I know that the transformation appears to have been world-spanning in scope and compressed in time, in a way that the documented communication infrastructure of the period struggles to explain. I know that the knowledge systems required to create and maintain such urban food forests appear to have been discontinued so completely that within a generation or two, no institutional memory of their existence at anything like their apparent former scale survived into the historical record. What I don't know is why. Not the simple why. Not the why of local municipal politics or colonial land conversion or the economics of industrial modernization. Those are real factors. They existed. They contributed. I am not dismissing them. I'm asking about a different why. I'm asking why the silence was so complete, why the mourning was so absent, why the knowledge was abandoned so quickly and so thoroughly, why the photographs in Archive Series 4 in Lyons show a food forest in 1871 and a gravel path in 1882, with nothing in between. No council minutes, no landscape contract, no letter of instruction, no receipt for the labour that removed the trees. Nothing. The evidence suggests something much larger than a landscaping decision. It suggests a civilizational discontinuity, a moment or a process so rapid it appears from our vantage point like a moment in which a certain way of understanding the relationship between cities and food and land and knowledge was not gradually replaced but simply stopped. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I find myself at the end of all this research standing in parks I used to walk through without a second thought, standing among ornamental trees that produce nothing, in cities that import every calorie they consume from hundreds or thousands of miles away, and asking a question that I cannot answer. Not when was this lost, not who decided to lose it, not even how the loss was coordinated across the entire surface of the civilized Earth within what appears to be a single human lifetime. No. The question I keep returning to is simpler and stranger than any of those. Was there a moment when the people living through this transition understood what was being lost? Did they stand in parks where food forests had been and feel the absence of something they couldn't name? Did they notice, the way we notice an old scar, not remembering the wound but sensing obscurely that the skin was once different there, or had the knowledge already been removed before the trees were removed? Had whatever process produced this transformation been thorough enough, coordinated enough, total enough to erase the understanding before it erased the evidence? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. And that uncertainty, more than any photograph, more than any archive gap, more than any pattern of suspicious uniformity across continents and centuries, that uncertainty is what keeps me in these archives. That uncertainty is what I cannot let go of. Because if the knowledge was erased deliberately enough, efficiently enough, worldwide enough, that the people living through its erasure did not notice they were losing something irreplaceable, then what else might we be standing in the middle of right now that we also cannot name?